Our next witness is Ms. Mittal.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee.
You want to, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
There.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting us to participate in your hearing today. At your request, my testimony will summarize the findings of the GAO's report that you released today on air and water pollution associated with concentrated animal feeding operations known as CAFOs. As you know, CAFOs can produce thousands of tons of manure a year, and if this manure is not properly managed, it can result in the release of a variety of harmful substances into the environment. Our report's findings also provide important context for evaluating EPA's recent proposal to exempt farms that have releases of hazardous substances from manure from CERCLA and EPCA's reporting requirements. First, we try to determine how many CAFOs are in operation and how much manure they actually produce. Unfortunately, because no federal agency collects data on CAFOs, no one knows exactly how many CAFOs are in operation. What we do know is that the number of large farms that raise animals increased by 230% between 1982 and 2002, and the number of animals raised on these farms has also increased. So we would expect that CAFOs have also experienced similar growth trends. What is more troubling, however, is that EPA does not have accurate, consistent, and complete data on the number, location, and size of those CAFOs that have been issued an NPDES permit, even though we're not talking about clean water today. Without this information, EPA cannot effectively regulate discharges from these CAFOs. Although we do not know exactly how many CAFOs are in operation, we can estimate the amount of waste an individual operation can generate. As you would expect, the amount of manure produced by a CAFO depends on a number of factors, including the type and number of animals raised and the feeding practices employed. A minimum-sized CAFO raising 8,200 layers, therefore, can produce about 2,800 tons of manure a year, while on the other extreme, a CAFO with 800,000 hogs can produce more than 1.6 million tons of manure a year. 1.6 million tons of manure, as has already been mentioned, is more than 1.5 times the human sanitary waste produced by the city of Philadelphia. For CAFOs that produce such large amounts of manure, hazardous substance releases can become a real issue. We also looked at the research that has recently been completed linking pollutants released by CAFOs to impacts on human health and the environment. We identified at least 34 studies that have researched this linkage and found that the majority of these studies established either a direct or an indirect link between specific air and water pollutants released by CAFOs and human health and environmental impacts. Only 7 of the 34 studies that we looked at found no such linkage. EPA has been regulating CAFOs under the Clean Water Act for almost 30 years and has long recognized the potential impacts that CAFO water pollutants can have on human health and the environment. It is only recently that EPA has become concerned about similar impacts for air pollutants released by CAFOs. However, EPA has yet to assess the extent of these impacts for either water or air pollutants because it lacks data on the characteristics of CAFOs nationwide and the amount of pollutants they are actually releasing. EPA told us that it does not have the resources to collect the nationwide data that it needs for water pollutants, but for air pollutants, a 2-year monitoring study was recently initiated in 2007 that is being funded largely by the industry. We also found that with regard to CAFO air pollutants that may be regulated under the Clean Air Act and are subject to CERCLA and EPCA requirements, EPA is still years away from having the air emissions protocols that it needs. The air emissions monitoring study was supposed to provide EPA with the scientific and statistically valid data needed to develop air emissions protocols by 2011. However, we identified several concerns with how the study is structured and being implemented that, if not addressed immediately, may result in EPA not obtaining the data that it needs to develop these protocols. In this regard, the timing of EPA's decision to exempt farms from EPCA's and CERCLA's reporting requirements is a concern because the monitoring study has not been completed. EPA does not know the extent to which hazardous substances are actually being released by animal feeding operations. In addition, EPA has not yet decided if it will aggregate all of the emissions occurring on an animal feeding operation or if the emissions will be considered separately to decide if an operation has exceeded allowable limits. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, given the dramatic changes that have occurred in the structure of the animal production industry, It is disconcerting that EPA lacks reliable data on the number, location, and size of CAFOs and the amounts of pollutants that they release. Without this information, EPA can neither effectively monitor the harmful substances released by these operations, nor can they conduct the necessary assessments of how these substances impact human health and the environment. That concludes my prepared statement. I'd be happy to respond to any questions that you might have.